Hi, hello, my name is Kiyoteru Tsutsui, and I'm a professor of sociology, director of the Japan program at Asia Pacific Research Center, and also a co-director of the Center for Human Rights and International Justice at Stanford University. Thank you for joining me in this session where I am going to talk about my book, Rights Make Might, Global Human Rights and Minority Social Movements in Japan. So I'd like to start with an explanation of why I got interested in this topic of minority activism in Japan. So I grew up in Japan in the mostly 80s and 90s. Japan at the time, and I guess still today, is known as a seemingly very homogeneous society. And I was under that impression growing up, in elementary school, middle school, high school. But I did find, I grew up in the western metropolitan area of Japan, and I did, and there's a little bit more minority presence in that region of Japan, and I found some signs of ethno-racial kind of discrimination in daily lives and some key moments in those areas. And I was very curious to try to understand why in this seemingly homogeneous society, and if you look at on outwardly the people who are discriminated, but they don't seem like any different from any other Japanese people, but there is some discrimination that surely existed. So I was curious about that issue. And then I got to college, I got to graduate school studying sociology, political sociology, and that was always part of my academic interest to understand ethnic tension, ethnic conflict. And I came to graduate school here at Stanford in the mid-90s to get my PhD. And that was a period in which in really all corners of the world, there were ethnic conflicts erupting. The Cold War ended, and the whatever the Soviets and the United States did to sort of manage ethnic tensions or help manage ethnic tensions in those countries with dictators and repressive rulers, that ended. And ethnic tensions turned into often violent, but sometimes non-violent conflicts. And I got really interested in understanding why it is spreading across the globe. There were ethnic conflicts everywhere, regardless of, and I started looking at the data. There was some quantitative cross-national kind of data being assembled during that time. And if you look at the data, it was evident that it's ethnic tensions are not confined to certain parts of the world. It's in democratic countries, it's in repressive countries, it's in wealthy countries, it's in underdeveloped countries, it's in mostly Muslim countries, it's in mostly Christian countries, it's in Buddhist countries. It's really regardless of the country's profiles, ethnic conflict was happening all over the world. So I thought that there may be something going on globally that is really giving rise to ethnic tensions and ethnic conflicts really across the globe. And I was trying to understand what that is. And I studied the history and also global sort of history up to the 1990s. And identified the spread of human rights, establishment of human rights institutions, and the diffusion of human rights ideas and universal human rights ideas. That was an important key to understand, important factor in understanding why ethnic conflicts are happening all over the world. So to make long story short, my key core hypothesis was that these ideas about universal human rights, it's universal. So everybody is entitled to fundamental human rights, regardless of their race, gender, and ethnicity, religious background, and so on. What that means is that people, groups that were resigned to the sort of second-class status in the previous under the previous understanding of who are entitled to certain rights, those groups now realize that they also deserve rights. They don't have to stay in the subjugated status anymore. So they started, they got empowered to politically mobilize and assert more rights. So their political claim making got started. And around the same time, the international institutions also emerged, especially at the United Nations, to establish human rights, promote and protect universal human rights ideas. And those institutions also helped not only spread these ideas about human rights, but also assist in subjugated groups' political claim making. Because previously those groups who were oppressed by the domestic government, national governments, they didn't have any recourse when their claims to the government were denied. But now, with transnational United Nations level human rights organizations in place, they can go to those institutions and pressure national governments from outside in. And those new processes empowered and encouraged and really materially helped minority rights claim making all over the world. So that was my hypothesis, and I wrote a dissertation doing a cross-national quantitative analysis by assembling data from 190 countries or so. And my hypothesis was found a good deal of support in sort of statistical analysis. So that was great, and I finished my dissertation, but I really wanted to understand the mechanisms and the processes through which international human rights, global human rights, these institutions and ideas facilitate minority rights activism. And that really brought me back to my original sort of personal and also academic interest in understanding minority rights issues in Japan, minority politics in Japan. So I went back to sort of Japan and examined minority activism in Japan. And in doing so, Japan was a good case because there were three most salient ethnic minority groups in Japan: Ainu, Koreans, and Burakumin. And really, this is more or less an exhaustive list of ethnic minorities of a certain size that existed throughout the post-World War II history of Japan. So I looked at the sort of level of political activism of those three groups, and then the book Rights Make Might is a result of that research. So I'm going to talk about these three groups one by one. The first is Ainu. Ainu is an indigenous people in northern parts of Japan, and they were after Japan's modernization, after the Meiji Restoration, 1867-68. Japan, the Meiji government, new modern Japanese government, incorporated the region, the big island of Hokkaido, very quickly for fear that Russia might come and take that region. And that was where many Ainu people lived. By the 19th century, most of the Ainu people were concentrated in that island, and also some in Russia too, what's today Russia's territory. And the modern Japanese government really tried to assimilate. Assimilation was the main mode of incorporation for Ainu people, and the Meiji government forcefully turned them from a hunting and gathering people to a farming community, inculcated ideology of Japanese empire and taught Japanese language and so on, trying to turn them into loyal citizens of Japan. And Ainu themselves kind of internalized a lot of that. And the title of that chapter is From Dying Race to an Indigenous People, that chapter on Ainu. So up until really the mid-20th century, Ainu was seen as a vanishing tribe. Right? They are an indigenous people that will be eventually assimilated into mainstream Japanese culture, society, and become Japanese citizens. That was the understanding. But in the 1970s, and that is when the global human rights really expanded, the process that I described in talking about the expansion of international human rights institutions, spread of human rights ideas in the world, that took off in the 1970s and impacted Ainu people. In particular, Ainu people were engulfed in the then really growing international indigenous rights movement. So they got exposed to the idea that the rights that they lost, the lands, culture that they had to give up in their efforts to become Japanese citizens, those things are indigenous heritage to be valued, and there's a potential for them to regain some of those lost lands and cultures and so on. And they really changed their approach. There used to be, there is an Ainu organization, but Ainu organization was really a funnel for government welfare because Ainu people still lived in so disadvantaged positions in Japan. So they did not want to take a confrontational stance against the government, and they were really obedient mainly to what the Japanese government told them to do. But all of a sudden, they changed their approach, not all of a sudden, but gradually in the 1970s and early 80s, as they got exposed to the indigenous rights ideas, their approach changed. And they started pushing for a new Ainu law. They started to make political claims domestically. The Japanese government was somewhat dismissive, mostly dismissive of those claims. And then Ainu people started going to international forums, and around that time, many international indigenous rights forums emerged, and Ainu people took full advantage of those forums. And that pressure from outside, because the Japanese government was quite sensitive to criticisms from outside, especially from the United Nations, as it had ambitions to become a permanent member of the Security Council of the United Nations. So slowly, the government accepted Ainu's claims about being a distinct group, being an ethnic minority group, and finally being an indigenous people of Japan. So fast forward to today, the activism succeeded in securing a new Ainu law, which it's not perfect, but at least it recognizes Ainu as an indigenous people and underscores the importance of protecting Ainu's ethnic culture and indigenous heritage. And now Ainu have, there's a national museum funded by the Japanese government budget, tax yen, in Hokkaido called Upopoi, that is a very popular venue. And this is a sort of place where tourists can go and experience Japanese Ainu cultural heritage. And it was built with a lot of Ainu input, so a lot of people are happy about it. And again, I'm not suggesting everything is perfect for Ainu people in Hokkaido. They still have faced some disadvantages. But compared to where they were in the 1970s, up until the 1970s, when they were seen as a vanishing tribe, dying race, they're in a much better position today, being recognized as an indigenous people of Japan. That's the story of Ainu. Koreans in Japan, colonial legacy group that was politically really active immediately after the end of World War II, but they were not very successful because they were not citizens of Japan after World War II, at the end of World War II, and they did not have any rights, and they also did not want to claim many rights in Japan either because they thought that they would go to their homeland, the Korean Peninsula, eventually. And there soon emerged a division between North and South Koreans. And by the 70s, there was also a division between different generations of Koreans in Japan. And not to mention the deep gulf between Korean communities in Japan and the mainstream Japanese people. So Koreans, they were asserting some right, but the government was in no hurry to recognize their rights. And it was difficult to put up a united front for the Korean community because of all this division, then also because of the understanding about their rights as being citizenship rights, not universal human rights. So citizenship rights accrue only to citizens, and they are not citizens of Japan. So it was somewhat quote unquote natural for a lot of people to see those rights as not being granted to Koreans in Japan. And Koreans themselves kind of saw things that way as well. Then, after the 1970s, as the Japanese government ratified international human rights treaties, ideas about universal human rights really entered into Japanese society. And now the understanding among the Korean communities, but also the Japanese people, changed from citizenship rights regime to universal human rights regime, under which, in the universal human rights regime, it doesn't matter whether somebody is identifies as a North Korean or South Korean, or first or second generation Korean, third generation Koreans, and really not whether they're not whether Japanese people with citizenship or Koreans with non-citizenship. Regardless of those statuses, everybody deserves certain fundamental rights. That was the universal human rights understanding. And under that, Koreans were able to unite, bridging across the division between North and South, different generations, and also gained a lot of support from Japanese community. And they started mobilizing for more rights, and many of the rights that they were claiming before the 1970s, by now they have gained those rights. Again, Koreans, not everything is perfect for Koreans in Japan, but compared to the 1970s, things are so much better in terms of the rights situation, much better today. So those are two groups, and the third group is Burakumin, and if Ainu went from a vanishing tribe to an indigenous people, and Koreans went from sort of citizenship rights regime to human rights regime, Burakumin went from a Japanese minority group to an international human rights organization. So Burakumin are a former outcast group that continue to face a lot of discrimination, social discrimination, not as much legal discrimination, but social discrimination, particularly in marriage and employment. And but because they were a larger group, they were in terms of the number of people, population, they were much bigger, and also they had every right. They had a voting right, so they were able to vote, and they had some political clout, and they were very well organized as well. So they started wielding some political clout early on. By the 1960s, they were able to secure some significant funding from the Japanese government to improve their inferior community infrastructure, which was often the basis for discrimination toward them. And then they still faced social discrimination in marriage, for instance. So they started going to using international human rights ideas to advance an understanding of universality of those rights to combat the social discrimination that they continue to face. Essentially, they wanted to sort of educate the Japanese public about the universality of rights. And as they started engaging in international human rights institutions, they understood that a lot of other groups, minority groups from the world, told them that they are such a resourceful and relatively more advantaged groups compared to other minority groups in the world. And they kept being told that they should not just claim their rights and report their plight in Japan, but also try to help other minority groups in Japan because they have the capacity to do so. And that really shifted their identity from just a Japanese minority group going to international forums to appeal their plight to an international sort of human rights actor trying to help other peoples in the world, other minorities in the world. So they established an international human rights organization as a wing of their activism, and by now that group is a really powerful force in international minority politics. And it served the group well because the domestic claims, they became much less vocal about that because they became a more established group, more like an interest group by now. But their activism goes on as an international human rights organization. So that's the story of Burakumin. And in all three groups' history, what's important, the impact of global human rights, is that it really changed their perspective, their understanding of where they stand in the community, in Japanese society, and the sort of subjective understanding changed, and that shifted their focus on their activism. In Ainu's case, it really gave rise to its political activism. Because of the existence of international human rights forums, that really helped them pressure the Japanese government to change its approach, especially for Ainu and Koreans, and that advanced their rights activism quite significantly. And in the process, I didn't say too much about it, but the book talks about how NGOs, civil society actors, both in Japan and international community, also helped advance their activism globally. So all these things combined, human rights, global human rights, as they spread throughout the world, helped, in this case, minority activism by Japanese minority groups. And that process, as I underscored in my dissertation, probably helped a lot of minority groups in the world. So the main point is that global human rights has this potential of empowering and encouraging political activism by minorities and really assist in them gaining more rights, better their lives in their local communities. So we face a lot of challenges to these ideas about global human rights today, but my research, my book, demonstrates how global human rights can really contribute to advancement of minority rights in the world. So I hope you'll take a look at my book, and thank you for listening in.